or to their fellow brethren. An enemy is in the opposite camp. Sinners actively work against God. The crucial point we need to recognize is that sin is much more than a series of bad deeds. It reflects a state of mind and heart. The first element in salvation is recognizing that we are sinners. We are born sinners. That's who we are. That means much more than recognizing that I commit sin A, B, and C. That is referring to the actions. But we need to go deeper than that to say that I am a sinner. I am someone who does commit sin because of my nature. Edward Vick says it means acknowledging that we are the kind of people who do such things. To recognize that we are sinners means that we recognize there is a power that lords it over us and prevents us from being what God intends us to be. That power, Paul says in Romans 3:9, is the power of sin. It is the power of sin that too many underestimate when they talk about sin as a sinful nature. Thus, they think that they can overcome sin as our sinful nature by overcoming sin A, B, and C. And the problem with that kind of thinking is that after sin A, B, and C is cared for, so to speak, we still remain sinners. Nothing has changed. When we fight with sin, with our sinful nature, most of the times we fight with the leaves instead of fighting with the root of it all. We can stop doing the bad things and still be selfish and mean and worse yet, proud of our goodness. Sinful human nature cannot be reversed by taking care of sins. Sinful human nature can only be reversed with God's intervention. There's no other way. Ellen White says in Christ Object Lessons, page 154, she says, by nature, the heart is evil. Of all the sins, talking about the self-righteous Pharisee, pride and self-sufficiency is the most hopeless, the most incurable. You see, you've heard many people that say, well, I'm becoming perfect. I'm pretty close. There's a few sins I have left to take care of, and I am there. The problem with that kind of thinking is that they're dealing with the actions, not with the sinful human nature, which only with a relationship with God we can take care of that. The New Testament's primary focus is on the level of sin as a sinful nature, rather on the level of sins as actions. And as a result, the New Testament speaks of becoming a new Christian, a new creation, as a result of crucifying self and having a rebirth experience and receiving a new heart and a new mind, which is a total transformation. That's why Paul said in Romans 12, verse 2, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Being saved is both accepting the death of Christ as our substitute and at the same time beginning to have our hearts transformed. That is, having our agape love refocused from self and sin as our sinful nature back to God. We are not adding salvation to our lives, but we are being transformed as we are being saved. When a person receives Jesus, when one receives righteousness, when one accepts Christ's death and resurrection and puts God back at the center of his or her heart, the result will be righteous living and righteous actions. Such actions naturally flow from an individual's new relationship with Jesus. Now that we understand a bit the nature of sin and sinful actions, it is obvious that when we talk about sin, we also need to talk about the law. Because without a law, you have no sin. But there is a law, therefore there is sin. I will give you the King James Version of 1 John 3, verse 4, which says, whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is a transgression of the law. New King James Version says sin is lawlessness, which is the same thing, breaking God's commandments. As Seventh-day Adventists, at times we love God's commandments and His rules and His laws and His regulations. But too often we neglect His law in words and in action. Just as we are more interested in itemized sins and itemized righteousness, so we are more interested in itemized laws than in God's basic law and the foundation of God's Ten Commandments. That may be because we have confused what is that nature of God's law. I think most of us know that the Ten Commandments is not the real law. You're like, what? If we think of the history of creation before planet Earth, the Ten Commandments might be viewed as a late development. In the book Spiritual Gifts, Volume 3, Sister White says that the principles of the Ten Commandments existed before the fall, the principles, and were of a character suited to the condition of a holy order of being. After the fall, the principles of those precepts were not changed, but additional precepts were given to meet man in his fallen state. Adam and Eve didn't need to say, honor your father and your mother. He didn't have a father and a mother. The angels in heaven didn't need to be told, thou shalt not kill. All they had to be told is love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and your fellow neighbor as yourself. That's all they had to be told. They didn't have to be, the law was not needed for them to be told in a negative sense, thou shalt not, but in a positive sense, love. Love God and one another. Angels and Adam and Eve before the fall did not have to be told, thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not steal, because they were positively motivated from the heart to love God and to love one another. Only after the entrance of sin in our world did the law have to be reformulated in negative terms for beings who were driven by selfishness and negative emotions. In Matthew 22, 37 to 40, Jesus makes the nature of the law behind the laws very clear. Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Their law and the prophets can also be a thought of the entire Old Testament. The law was the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, the other writings the prophets wrote. Everything in the Old Testament could be hanged on these two. Love God and love your neighbor. Paul says in Romans 13, verse 10, that love is the fulfilling of the law. And in James 2, 8 and verse 10, continues these thoughts by saying that